I'm going to focus on two things here. One is opening text files, which we started yesterday. And what we're going to do is add the idea of filtering the files that can be opened. And this is something that you're probably come to, if not expect, at least be aware of, if only unconsciously. That is, if you're say running Microsoft Word, there are a set of file extensions that are available to it to be opened. That gets set when you install that particular application. And so when you go to open a file, it will typically not let you open, even select a file that doesn't have the right extension. So we'll see how to do that in Java. And then we're going to look at saving stuff, because the idea, when you're saving something, then there are a whole bunch of issues that come up, some of which I've addressed. If you haven't already, and even if you have before this morning, if you could pull my code if you want to follow along, or not. So rather than writing the code in front of you, I wrote it already. I didn't comment it yet. It will be commented and pushed, but I wanted to get the thing out. And it's still, again, this is anything hardly a finished application. And the idea here is to show you and expose what kinds of issues are involved when we're doing things like trying to open a file and to save a file. As I've mentioned previously, we're not dealing with binary files yet. What I'm planning on doing, just FYI, for next week is I'm going to take some time and look at how Java interacts with a simple relational database. Now, I don't know how much experience you've had with databases, so we're going to learn just enough SQL to be a little dangerous. If you have dealt with databases before, then that should be review. But that's what's going to be on tap for next week. And what's on tap for this week, again, we're going to look at some of these issues. So here's another example. If you're running a Microsoft Word program, and let's say you create a new document, and then you go to save it, and then when you go to save it, you type in the name of the file that you're saving. Now, if you don't put in the extension, which for the current version of Word is .docx, then Word will put it in for you. And that doesn't happen by itself. That happens because the programmers who developed Word decided that Word shouldn't save any documents that don't have the right extension. So how do you check that? We'll see how to check that in Java. And I know Word is not written in Java, but the thing is that these issues that we're addressing come up regardless of what programming language you're using. They have to do with how the application interacts with the user and what kinds of things that you come to expect. The second thing that we're going to look at is, and this comes up when saving, but not when opening, which is that if you're going to save a file, then we're not going to get to this level of subtlety. But again, just sort of thinking of Word, if we're editing a particular document and you hit save, then it just sort of overwrites the document that you're in. The presumption being that if you're editing this file and you decide to save it, then it's a reasonable assumption that that's what you mean to do. However, if you do a save as, then what that will let you do is choose the file that you want to save it to. And the question is, if you decide to choose a file that you're going to write the current state of your document to that exists already. In other words, if you are about to clobber a file that already is there, then what should the good behavior be? And that behavior should be confirming that you're about to overwrite it. In other words, if you do a save as, and you decide to save it as a file that already exists, what you will see is a little pop-up dialog that says, hey, you're about to overwrite this file, or this file exists, so you're going to overwrite it. Do you really want to do that? So at least you give the user a chance to not clobber a file without any comment. Early text editors did not do that, very, very early ones. So how did this feature come about? It came about after probably a lot of cursing and regret, where somebody accidentally clobbered a file. So, well, again, we'll see how to do that in Java, but again, this is independent of any particular language. This is what we're doing with these action listeners and the like, is how Java does it. And then one thing we haven't touched on too deeply, but we will, is how to write to a file. When we've been reading from a file, we've been using the scanner thing, and that's a nice way of reading text. If we want to write, if we have a string, and we basically we have a string which is going to be in our text area, and we want to write that to a file. Again, how do we do that? It's with something comparable, where we have a file writer that's going to send the bytes to the file. And then, especially if we have a very large file, a large amount of text that we're writing, we want to pass that to a buffered reader, in this case, which is going to do it in an efficient way. In other words, it's going to grab chunks of the string and just sort of feed them out without doing it like byte at a time or even word at a time. So we'll see what all that is about when we okay, so if you've done a poll, let me just make sure I'm up to date on this. So if we do a poll on mine, not yours, and okay, so come on. All right, so there are two files, two new files. One is called open and save, and the other is run open and save. Actually, the run open and save is pretty much what we've seen. Very short. I like nice short classes. So just in the main, we're basically just instantiating and then running this on the event queue. And this is where it may not be completely apparent, but especially when we're either reading a large file or writing a large file, making sure that we do those activities off the graphics thread, while this code ensures that the frame is put on the graphics thread, and that's via something called the event queue. And this thing invoke later, that's just what they call it. There are a couple of other options for event queue. We can see like invoke and wait is, or some other things, is dispatch thread. Again, if the current event queue's dispatch thread was what they call it. And basically, we can test whether a particular thread is that. Again, we're not going to go that deeply into it. So anyway, so here's, let me close the other ones just to, for some reason, My mouse just likes to put extra clicks in. Okay, so this open and save class has a bunch of stuff in it. So let's see what that's about. First, it extends JFrame. That's sort of the standard way of creating the main window, which encloses the application. And for this, we have three instance variables. Again, like everything that we talked about earlier, understanding what variables are and where they are. So these three are instance variables, and as such, they are private. They are instance variables because we want the different methods, and in this particular case, the inner classes, to have access to these. The principle, which I think I might have mentioned earlier in the course, but bears repeating, is that ideally variables should be defined in the smallest scope that that makes them usable. For example, this text area, as we saw yesterday, is where the text of the file that we open is going to be read. So this needs to have access, this needs to be accessible by, in this particular case, the inner class that's going to read and write the text. In order for that to happen, first of all, it needs access from the, in this case, the init method, which instantiates things. So here where we instantiate it, and then we're going to put it in a scroll pane, because as we saw last time, if we don't, then if it's larger than our file, we can't get to the bottom part of it. And the scroll pane allows us to have these little sliders to do it. But somewhere we need to instantiate it and put it in there. So it needs access. This method needs access to it. So here are our choices. If I have a method and it needs access to a variable, it can either be a local variable or it can be an instance variable. Now here, notice that the text area needs to be an instance variable because of the other objects that are going to need access to it. But notice that the scroll pane is a local variable. Why? Because you don't need access to that. Once I create the scroll pane, the only thing that it's used for is for the user to be able to, to grab little scroll things. And basically this thing right here in this editor is a scroll pane. And so I don't need access to this variable. And so I put it in the smallest possible scope, which is in this case a local variable. However, I do need access to the text area by other things, and so I make it an instance variable. So if they're like when you're developing your applications, and again, not just in Java, but elsewhere, then that's the principle that I hope you apply as well. Okay, so let's run this thing and just sort of see what it is, and then we'll unpack it. So okay, so hopefully you can see it, because I think it was sharing my whole desktop. Okay, so what we have here is we have a couple of things. One is we have the title here, and the title is going to be changing. We have some buttons here, and this is kind of roughly to mimic a ribbon or toolbar or something like that in a admittedly crude way. But when you have one of these ribbons or things, basically it's just another, you can think of it as just another panel with more widgets on it. And Microsoft has been big on pushing this whole ribbon idea, and they have lots of different widgets in it, and that's and that's fine. But the menus are still something which one would expect. So we have two menus here, and the file menu basically mimics our little toolbar or ribbon thing. Why? Because This way the user gets to choose if I do it in one click or more than one click. And I've also added kind of a help file, and that's just going to be have like an about. And if I click the about, it's just going to say, just have a little thing about, that says about. This is something which is fairly typical. You might also have, like in applications under help, you also will have things like check for updates. Again, that's a little more complicated than we want to get into. It might have a built-in help. And actually Java has a very nice way of creating help, the linked help files that are HTML, and you can search and do a bunch of other things. Again, that's way beyond what we have here. But okay, so this is a minimal menu bar. And the idea is, and then we have a status label down here, which is just going to kind of keep track of where we are. So we're going to, if I click open, then, okay, now what I have here, notice that some of these files are kind of grayed out. So what's with that? Notice in the file format, I have, one is sort of only text files. But if I open that up, I see that I can also choose CSV files, TSV files that we've seen, or XML files. And notice when I click the XML files, now all of a sudden this build XML file is live, so I can select it. See, when it wasn't there, all of a sudden it's gray, and I can't select these things. But I can if I select it. I open it up, and here's what's changed. So one is the text in that XML file is copied into the area here. The name of the file is now in the title. Okay, again, that's something which in many applications you will see, and that's a valuable thing because it lets you know in a fairly unobtrusive way what file we're looking at. And then in the status bar, what it did was it basically told you how much time it took to open that. Okay, and then now if I want to say, okay, what does save do? So save brings up again a one of these little file chooser things. It will let me select the file that I want, but now, okay, notice that if I click on save, it will say, oh, by the way, this exists overwrite. So that's what I was talking about before. So here, and rather than doing the save as, here I'm just being, let's say a little bit annoying. If ideally there would be both a save and a save as, but again, that would just introduce some more complexity. So if I cancel, then nothing happens. I also have a close button to say, what does close do? So close will just basically empty everything out. Now notice there's no file, there's nothing in the text area, and there's no file selected. So now one thing, notice that the text area is live. I don't know if you can see the cursor, but so I can do something like type in some text, and then I can go to save that. Now I don't want to save it as my build XML file. It'll, in fact, let me just gonna say, so what it does, and this is sort of hardwired in a little bit, but if I don't give it an extension, it's going to give an extension of .txt. Okay. And it gave me a file extension of XML, which isn't quite what I wanted, but that's all right. So we'll look at that. There's a little bit of a bug there. Now, also when I exit, it's going to give me an opportunity to either to do any of this. So again, there are 3 ways of exiting, which is fairly typical. Again, I can exit it from the menu bar here. I can exit it from the toolbar, or I can just close the window down. Okay, so let's look at how that, so some of this we've already done. And all right, so let's go through the init, and we'll kind of look at a lot of this is just sort of what we've done before. So this window closer is the same thing that we had before. So it extends the window adapter, implementing window listener, which is, and then action listener. So, and again, the idea here is that there's one piece of code that's always going to be executed regardless of how I close it. The entry point is either from the window, which is why I need this window closing, or from a button or menu item, and that's where the action performed comes in. So that's what causes you to confirm from the user rather than just kind of closing down and losing whatever you have saved. Okay, so the status label, again, we've done this before. So again, the status, because the status label needs access from the different inner classes that will update the status, it needs to be an instance variable so that they will have access to it. So that's why this is an instance variable. And again, notice here that the exit listener is a local variable, and that's because the only things that need it are the variables that are defined in here in init. Okay, we did this last time. Okay, this is how we set up the J menu bar. And we set it because, and it's a set, not an add, because there's only one menu per application. So we create a J menu, which is the file menu. We've done that before. And now we're adding, this is where we add the 4 menu items. So let's see what that does. Again, just to reflect. So open, save, and close. Open, save, and close. Now notice something here too. Notice that I put a little line there because these 3 tasks, these 3 actions have to do with manipulating the application, whereas the exit is something else. And so and you see this in a typical menu where there'll be like this little separator where you have groups of actions that are together. And so I can kind of separate those, which is a fairly nice user thing. And I do that by this call right here. When I say add separator, that's what puts this little line here. Okay. So, and then the way I've organized it, there are a number of different ways of organizing it. So here, what I've decided to do is to just first lay out all the different items, and then hook them up to their listeners a little later. So here's where I add another menu, the help menu. And then when I add it, that's what adds this help. And then here's where I have its one menu item, which is the about. And I add that. So at this point, and then here's the text area. And then likewise, here's the button panel is this thing right here. And I have open, save, and close buttons. And that's just what they are. So when I make it to here, I have created the widgets and put them in so that they're visible, but they don't do anything yet. So if I were to just leave things right here, then nothing would happen. So I decided to, again, they're just in terms of a different way of organizing it. So I instantiate all of the action listeners here. And then I add them here. So I instantiate them and then add them again. It's just a different way of organizing it. So the open menu item, I add the open action listener, which I've defined up here. And then I also do that to the open button. Again, because they are both going to exactly the same object. In other words, the open action listener object is listening to both the open menu item and the open button. That guarantees that exactly the same uh, thing will happen, whether I do it from the menu or from the button. That's why using instances of named inner classes is a better way to do it than what you will sometimes see of anonymous inner classes, which unfortunately the book uh, decided to promulgate, which is why I haven't really emphasized reading what the book does. The book actually has some nice references for a lot of these different things. So if you're looking at for that, but if you're looking to the book for how to do this action listener stuff and the other things, then it's not the ideal one. Okay, so now that all the listeners are set up, let's kind of look at how we do this. So now here, the open action listener is a class, and because it has a potentially long task, which is reading a file, and actually we'll see an example of that when we try to read a big file. The file chooser needs to be an instance variable because, does it really? Well, it needs to be an instance variable because I want to maintain its state upon different calls. In this case, unlike the previous one, I've made the executor service also an instance variable because I, rather than awaiting terminate, rather than shutting it down, I'm going to leave it open so that we can keep reusing the same executor service every time we call it. So again, that's kind of a choice. So rather than, it's kind of like green programming. So do we instantiate a new one at each call, or do we reuse the old one? So the quote wasteful way is to instantiate a new one, and sometimes that's necessary. But the green way is to instantiate a new one, to keep the one, to keep reusing the same one. Now, see here, and this is where, if you remember, we talked about what happens with local variables and their scope. If this were a local variable, then as soon as you return from the action performed method, then that variable would go away. So the only way, or not the only way, but the way which minimizes the scope of a variable which is going to persist over different calls to the same object, the same instance of this, is to have an instance variable. Okay, so that's why we made that an instance variable. And here I did the lazy instantiation with it as well. So again, all this could have been just put in the constructor. Again, it's a matter of choice. Okay, so let's take a look at what is here for the file chooser. Okay, before we just kind of did a file chooser, but here there are a bunch of options which are what which caused it to do this. In other words, to give me a list of possible files that it can open and only let me use the ones that I can choose there. Okay, so that is what using something called a file filter. We've actually seen a file filter before when we were using the file objects, and unfortunately, they have the file filter in Swing is incompatible with that. It's a completely different class. So even though it has the same name, it's in a different package, which makes it a different class entirely. So that's just kind of what it is. The most useful one is something which is built in, which is called a file name extension filter. So here I instantiate the file chooser and I put it in the user dir directory, which is where I'm running it. If I don't do that, then I think it depends on which platform you're running in. On a Mac, it will open up in my home directory. On Windows, I believe it will open up in the Documents directory. But in this particular case, I want it to open in this directory. And if it's the case that you want to open your file chooser in another one, or if you're okay with it opening in your home directory or the Documents directory, then you can just leave it empty. Okay, so now here's where when I say accept all file filters used false, what that does is that actually turns off. See, by default, it says all files. If I go to say, let's see, this isn't gonna let me save, but let me open something. And all right, so let me open it. If I wanted to save it, notice that here I allow all file format as well. So that's what the accept all file filters use. And when I set that to false, that turns that off. And then what I'm doing is I'm adding what's called a choosable file filter. And then Java provides something called a file name extension filter, which is the most common way of filtering these. There are other ways, but this is the most common and the most useful. So it has a constructor in which the first argument is just a description. So that's where I put, so in this case, there's the first one, text files, start.txt. And then what I give it is I give it the string, which is the desired extension. So here I've given it lowercase, txt, and uppercase. I've done that in both cases. Why? Because in all platforms, or at least in Macs and Windows, I can have like a text file that's either lowercase text or uppercase text. Likewise with CSV files, TSV, and even XML files. So I don't know whether the file I'm choosing has lowercase or uppercase. So, but in this case, because I can list them, this filter, when I've chosen that, will only see text ones. Whereas this one for XML, again, if I switch to XML, it'll see those. And then what I did this just so the order, like I wanted to allow other things because things like this properties file is not listed here. So if the user decides they want to do that, then they can, in this case, open up the properties file and then do that. And then so I set it back to true, and that was simply to rearrange the order. Okay, so now this executor service is only going to have like a single thread going on. And then we've basically done this before, but just to review, this is my choice. So if I go to open, in this case, if I have all files, then let's say if I choose the build, or if I cancel, then nothing happens. So that's how my choice is approve if I've approved it. And then I get the current file. Now notice the current file is an instance variable of the whole class, and that is because I need access to that. And then I'm going to submit this because this is also a runnable, and that will invoke this on a separate thread, and that's kind of the key. So here again, the file reader, buffer reader, scanner, we've done this before. So I clear the text. Now I set the status label to opening that, and that'll go away very quickly for a small file that we've been doing. And then here's where I time it. We've kind of done this before too. So I'm gonna mark the time when I start, and then at the end I'll have this, and then I can set my status label to how long it took, and that's what causes this to happen. Just a little, again, integer arithmetic thing. These milliseconds are in longs. So if I want to turn it into a millisecond into a second, I divide by 1,000, or this is slightly quicker. multiplied by 1,000th. Okay, so we've seen that pretty much. Now let's look at the save one. Okay, so for save, now if this were kind of more fully developed, which, you know, again, as Mason said to Dixon, you have to draw the line somewhere. Okay, so here's, let's say I want to save my build copy in my home directory. Okay, so now here what I've noticed, now I have build copy here, and then it also marked how long it, how many seconds it took to save. So let's see what that's about. So that's the save action listener. So again, I have an executor service, which is going to be a separate one. Probably if, and here's, like I said, this is not a, by any means, a finished and complete application. One thing that would possibly be an improvement is to make this executor service, have one executor service for everything and have it be an instance variable of the outer class. That would actually be a little bit, I think that would be a slightly better design overall. But again, we're going with what our first cut here. Okay, so this is what we're looking for, is what happens when we try to save. Now, what it does is it saves it as the last thing that we saved. And again, that's something that could be tweaked. Again, if we don't want to save it, if we want to be able to cancel. So what are we looking at here? Again, it's an action listener and a runnable. Okay, so the first thing is that what do we do if we're trying to save an empty file? Now, that's something we may want, but for an application like this, this is probably not what we want. So here we have, there's nothing there, and if I go to save, then I'm not saving anything. And so instead I say, hey, you know, the current text is empty. And how do I know that? Well, if the length of the text area is 0, then I say the current, I've misspelled this, of course, the current text is empty. And what I've done is with J option pane, I've shown a message dialog. Again, a message dialog just simply says, okay. So how did I do that? I had the message, the title, and then the option was an okay option instead of okay cancel option, because that's the only option for the user. And then the other thing to notice is that these are what are called modal dialogues. In other words, I can't do anything with the application until I dismiss this. See, so I mean, nothing is live here. I have to click that. It's called a modal dialogue. Again, you don't have to remember the name. Okay, so again, the file chooser, executive service. All right, so here I say here if I actually have something. If I go to save it now, and unfortunately it had my old one here. So okay, so again, I have the opportunity to cancel or approve. So if I approve, then let's see what I have. So the selected file, I get the selected file again as a, notice the scope of this. It's just within this this if statement. Okay, so and I want to consider whether to put an extension on. So if I don't have a current file, then I'm going to put the index of the current file in. Otherwise, I'm just going to put text in. And then, well, then what is this about? Yeah, so if it doesn't end with the current extension, and I do everything in lowercase just because I want to make sure that it actually passes, not due to case, then what I do is I actually set the selected file to the same name as the previous one plus the current file extension. Okay, so now so now what happens if it exists, then I say I'm going to try to overwrite it. And again, if for some reason it's putting the XML in, that's a little bug that so I can either cancel that or save that. So overwrite, if I decide to overwrite, then yes. How do I do that? I check to see whether the selected file actually exists. And if so, then I want another confirmation. So do you want to save? Yes. If so, are you going to overwrite? Otherwise, okay. So, and now here I'm saying if it's not okay, then I'm just going to return and not do anything.
Arnie, question. So the confirm is an integer, and then OK option represents a number, or
Yes.
a template.
Yeah, great question. Okay, so and this is kind of a bit of an old-fashioned way of doing things, but it's in Java. So what is this? In fact, if let's go to the declaration of OK option, and we see that in J option pane, it's a public static final int. Its value happens to be 0, but we don't want to know or care about that. So the way that this works is that if I show a confirm dialog, then it will either return the OK option or it will return something else. If it returns something else, that is, if it's not the OK option, then I'm just going to be out of there. So yes, the OK, what it does is it returns an int. And so we can see that here. See, show confirm dialog, public static int. So it returns an int, and that int says whether or not the user has clicked OK or cancel. Okay? Okay, so here's how we write a file. So again, and I want to time it. So again, I'm going to stamp the start time. I'm going to set the text of my status label to, I'm saving it, and this is going to come in if in a minute. I'm going to open up a big, do this with a big file. So now, by analogy to we've seen file readers and file writers, file readers and buffered readers. Now there's a file writer and a buffered writer. So if it's a small file, the file writer is enough. If it's a ton of stuff, then we want to use a buffered writer because otherwise it's going to, this just is for efficiency's sake. But the buffered writer does have a method called write. And in this case, we're going to write the whole thing, relying on the fact that the buffered writer is going to do it efficiently. In other words, we're going to give it this huge blob of this huge string, or potentially huge string, and the buffered writer is just going to write it, and it's going to write it in an efficient manner. How does it do that? What it's going to do is it's going to grab it a certain number of bytes at a time, and then write those in a buffered manner. And then we want to make sure we close it. Having done that, we're going to stamp the end time. And then here's where we set the title. Notice that the title was changed to the file that we're looking at. And so this is where we set it to the name. And then here's where we update the status label. Again, an integer times 1,000 is kind of the fast way to do that. Okay, so now remember we had this this movie file that was TSV. And so here it is. And it takes a little while to open. So it's actually, oops. I think it takes about 30 or 40 seconds to open. Why? Because it's a huge file. So this is why, oops. This is why we want to have it in a separate thread from the graphics thread, because if it were on the graphics thread, then we wouldn't be able to do, again, it's grinding and whirring because it's literally reading, I think, a gigabyte or two of data. But, and it's kind of stressing it a little bit to do that. But the application is still fairly live. In other words, we can move this around. Okay, I took a little over a minute to open it. It's still actually all there. Okay. And if we want to save it, okay, so for some reason this should, okay, so okay, so it actually took less than a second to save it. So the buffered writer is very efficient. It took a lot longer to read it. Possibly if we use maybe it's because the scanner is not as efficient as we'd like. But this is why, though, again, notice it took more than a little over a minute to read in all that stuff. But it only took a little bit to save it. So again, that's probably because the scanner was not as efficient as it could have been. But that's why all the fuss about threads and the event queue. The event queue or graphics thread is what draws this thing on the screen and allows us to manipulate it. If we're doing a lengthy task and reading in this long file was a lengthy task, we need to do that in a separate thread. And that's why we did it via the executor service and a separate one. If we had put it all in, we could have sort of put it all in here, but then it would be in the graphics thread. Okay, so and actually in doing this demo, I realized that there are actually a few little quirks to this that I need to fix up. I will fix that up and push that, and then hopefully later today I will also upload what I'm going to have you do, because I'm going to have you do something sort of like this. Okay.